All right, welcome to our macroeconomics class. In this lecture, we want to cover Chapter 11 on unemployment. So let's begin this chapter on with a question. What kind of unemployment do you think is caused by smartphones? So if you think through that a little bit, you'll probably come to realize that lots and lots of things have been replaced in the physical world that now reside in what we'll call the digital world, or in the world of software. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's just kind of go through some of these concepts, though. Unemployment. What is it, and how is it measured, and who measures it? We begin by recognizing that the unemployment rate, we have two rates that we really concentrate on as macroeconomists when it comes to the labor market and how we analyze the labor market. So we'll look at the unemployment rate and also the labor force participation rate. Note that both of these are rates, so when you see a rate, remember that that's also a ratio, or something's going to be divided by something else. It's going to be put into some kind of a context. Rates are ratios. You can also remember that. It might be helpful. So who measures to determine the unemployment rate? Actually, in the United States, there are two different surveys that are conducted, one by the Department of Labor and another one by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the first survey is called the Current Population Survey, or the CPS, and that survey goes out and samples 60,000 households to try to determine what the unemployment rate is. The second sample is called the Current Employment Statistics Survey, and that is a sample of 160,000 businesses and government agencies that represent 400,000 individual employees. So a sample is conducted from that group to also estimate the unemployment rates and the labor force participation rate. Once again, remember there are two rates that we're trying to estimate. So the first thing that we think about with unemployment is who actually can be included in this unemployment category. The first thing that we do is we take the total population, and then we just look at the adults, and we define adults in the U.S. for purposes of the unemployment rate as individuals who are 16 and above. So we start with everybody in the country, and this data is a couple of years old, but we had 320 million people in the U.S. That represented 100% of our population. If we just look at those who are age 16 and older, it's about 254 million, so about 80% of the population fall into that category. If you're under 16, that's about 20% of the U.S. population. We do not consider anyone under 16 in terms of our analysis of unemployment. So 254 is a number that we're going to look to. We start at the 320. We take out all the under 16s. That leaves us at 254. So we've got the 254, and we further divide that into two groups, what we call not in the labor force and in the labor force. Today, about 160 million are in the labor force, which leaves about 94 million that are not in the labor force. So we're going to go through and look at how these two categories are defined and analyzed. So to not be in the labor force, the first requirement is that you're not employed. If you're not employed, you're not in the labor force. You can actually be in the labor force and be not employed, but in order to be in the not in the labor force, you have to not be employed. We'll come back and see how that makes sense. The other category that we put in the not in the labor force category are full-time students. So all of you here today, even though you may have a job, if you are a full-time student, that's equivalent to about 12 credit hours active enrollment. That would put you in the full-time student category, so we don't count you even though you have a job. The next category are homemakers. My wife, once again, has 7 children, but she is not included in the workforce or the labor force because she is considered a homemaker. Next category are members of the armed forces or the military. They're not included. And then we also have retirees. Grandpa and grandma that have retired are considered not to be part of the labor force. And then the last category we term discouraged workers. A discouraged worker is someone who has had a job, lost their job, and has not looked for a job in the last 4 weeks. So I could be unemployed for 10 years, but if I look for a job every week, I'm still part of the labor force. If I have not looked for a job in the last 4 weeks, you then move out of the labor force into the not in the labor force category under the subcategory discouraged worker. All right, so labor force, you got to be 16 and older who have jobs or are looking for jobs. So that constitutes the currently employed and the unemployed. The labor force participation rate simply looks at how many do you have in the adult population. We look at the percent that are currently in the labor force over your total adult population. So this is a little chart that shows you that participation rate. Go back to the 1950s. The labor force participation rate was around 60%. So if you were 16 and older, about 60% of the people in that category were in the labor force. Note in the around 65, it started to climb, and it peaked in 1995, 1998, somewhere in there, leveled off, and then it declined. So we can see kind of three different points in time. This where it's fairly stable. We have this jump up, and then it's level. And we actually have four different categories here. So that last category, it looks like a decline. Anybody have an idea why we had this big jump in the labor force participation rate from, excuse me, about 1967, excuse me, up to about 1990? Okay, what we really saw during that period was a large increase in the labor force participation rate by women. Prior to that time, they typically were homemakers. Many women in the 60s began really to seek full-time work and entered the labor force. So the participation rate increased substantially. All right, so if we take a look at this chart here, it shows the labor force participation rate by gender. Note that in the late 40s, almost 80% of men, adult men, were in the labor force, and it was around 30% from women. Over time, the labor force participation rate for men has declined, and the labor force participation rate from women has increased. So we note that demographic that's occurred over time. More women are in the labor force, less men in the labor force relative to historical rates. So here's the way that we could think about it. We have 160 million in the labor force. Of that 160 million, about 152 million, or about 95% of that category, are employed, which leaves about 7.7 million, or around 4.8%, that are unemployed. Once again, when we calculate the unemployment rate, it's the number of employed divided by the labor force. Also, remember the labor force is equal to the unemployed plus the employed. Okay, so to be employed, you have to, first of all, if you're a paid employee, you're considered employed. If you're working in your own business, you're also considered employed, even though you might not be earning any money or your business might be losing money. For purposes of the unemployment rate calculation, you're considered employed. The next category are individuals who work in their family businesses but are not paid. So if my son works for me in my family business and I don't pay him, he is technically considered employed. But he's also got a be at least 16 years old in order for him to be considered employed, even though he's not paid. The other thing that has to be true is that he cannot be a full-time student. So if he is a full-time student and works in the family business and is paid, he's still not considered employed because of that one condition that prevents him from being part of that rate. Okay, so the next category is it includes all workers, both full-time and part-time. So I could be working 80 hours a week, or I could be working 1 hour a week. As long as I have a job and I fall into that category, I would be included and considered as employed. Also, if I have a job but I'm away temporarily, maybe I'm sick or on vacation, you're also considered part of the employed category. So the unemployed are people that are not employed. That's the first requirement, that they are available to work, and they have tried to find a job in the last 4 weeks. Who are those who are unemployed but have not tried to find a job in the last 4 weeks? Who would that be? Yeah, those are our discouraged workers. If you have not looked for a job in the last 4 weeks, you're no longer unemployed. You actually move to the discouraged worker category, and that category fits under the not in the labor force category. Okay. Also, if you've been laid off and you're waiting for a recall to go back to work, you're considered unemployed. So the unemployment rate is the number unemployed divided by the labor force. Remember, the labor force is the number unemployed plus the number employed. So in the U.S., for example, if we take a look at the total population, the first thing that we would do is remove all of the members of your population that are under 16. In the U.S., it's around 20%. So that leaves about 254 million that are adults. So if you're adult, you fall into one of three categories. You're employed, you're not in the labor force, or you're unemployed. If we just focus on the labor force, that's going to be the number employed plus the number unemployed. And if we looked at that, we would note that the total labor force consists of about 160 million people, of which 152 are employed and about 7.7 million are unemployed. So if we took that 7.7 million and divide it by 160 million, that's where we would get that unemployment rate of about 5%. All right. So the way to summarize this is we start with the total population. That's 100% of our total population. Pull out the under 16, and that would leave us with the adult population, which is 16 and above. So we take 20% of our population out, set them aside. Now we have 100% of the adults, or 254 million. Now, the not in labor force category, almost a little over around 94 million are not in the labor force. That'd be about 37% of the adults are not in the labor force. Once again, you right now as a full-time student would be in that category. You're not in the labor force, even though you might have a job. Okay, if we take 254, the number of adults, take away the number that are not in the labor force, 94, we'd end up with about 160 million that are in the labor force. Now we're ready to do the analysis of the unemployment rate by taking that labor force of 160 million and figuring out one of two categories. You're either employed or you're unemployed. Now, if you are unemployed, or the rate is actually calculated based on the percentage unemployed in the total labor force. Let's back up for a moment and see if we can see where the labor force participation rate is. Any idea where that's at? Yeah, it's right there. So 63% of the adult population are in the labor force. Now that's the number for the U.S. In China, it's much higher. In a place like Saudi Arabia, it's much lower. So we tend to watch that number over time to see if that's moving up or down. The other important number is the percentage unemployed divided by the total labor force, and that's the number that we find right there. 7.7 million is 4.8% of 160 million. All right, so economists really kind of look at these two numbers, the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. Here's a little quiz question for you. If someone has been in the labor force, they had a job, and they got fired from their job, and now they're unemployed, and they've been looking for a job for a couple of months, and now they've given up on looking for a job, and they leave. They have not looked for a job in 4 weeks. What will happen to the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate? Yeah, the unemployment rate actually goes down because that person is no longer in the labor force. They move from the labor force category up into the not in the labor force category. So the unemployment rate goes down, but in the labor force rate also goes down. So that helps us identify what happened there. Did that person leave unemployment and get a job, or did they leave unemployment through discouragement, and now they're no longer in the labor force? Okay, so here's what we're going to do is let's think about some problems that we may have with these rates. The first problem we think about is that maybe the unemployment rate is overstated. And by overstated, we mean that if I report that 5% are unemployed, could that 5% actually be overstated or above the real number or the actual number? Yeah, it could be, because we know that there are workers that work for cash, that they report as being unemployed, but they're actually working for cash. So if I say the unemployment rate is 5% after we recognize those employees that are working for cash, it actually is more like 4%. So in that case, unemployment rate is overstated. Now, the opposite problem occurs when the unemployment rate is understated. If I say it's 5%, 5% could actually be an understatement of the unemployment rate because we have discouraged workers. Although they're technically not included in the unemployment statistics, they have left the labor force. They're no longer in the labor force because they've become discouraged. So if we're real happy about the unemployment rate going down, it could be just the fact that many of our unemployed workers have become discouraged, left the labor force, and that would cause the labor force, that would cause the unemployment rate to go down. So it looks like our unemployment rate is going down, but those workers are not getting jobs. They've actually left the labor force and gone to the not in the labor force discouraged worker category. So those are two big problems with, or not big problems, but two problems with unemployment. So we'll have some quiz questions about this. You've got quiz questions on your this chapter that hopefully you've got completed by now. But we will also have some quiz questions on these two chapters on Friday. All right, thank you for watching this video.